Mike Wolfe's story began in a small town where he grew up with a passion for collecting things. While most kids his age were interested in sports or hanging out with friends, Mike had a different interest. He was fascinated by old, forgotten objects, things that others might see as useless. To him, these items told stories and held hidden value. From a young age, Mike started looking for antiques, whether they were old furniture, rusty tools, or vintage signs. It wasn't just a hobby, it became his mission. He spent hours searching through garage sales, flea markets, and even abandoned houses, hoping to find something valuable that others had overlooked. Over the years, Mike's passion turned into a career. He didn't just collect things for fun, he began selling them and making a living out of it. Slowly but surely, Mike's name started to get recognized in the world of antique collecting. People knew him as the guy who could find rare treasures in the most unexpected places. It wasn't long before his passion and skill caught the attention of TV producers who saw potential for a show about his work. And that's how American Pickers was born. The show was an instant hit. Mike, along with his co-host Frank Fritz, traveled across the United States, searching for antiques and rare collectibles. Viewers loved seeing their interactions, the excitement of the finds, and the stories behind each object. Mike's personality was key to the show's success. He had a charm that made him relatable, someone people could root for. He didn't just care about making money from these items, he cared about their history, about preserving the past. His respect for the items he found gave him a unique place in the world of collecting. As American Pickers grew in popularity, Mike's fame skyrocketed. He became a household name, and his career as an antique expert took off. He was invited to speak at conventions, featured in magazines, and his face became recognizable to millions of people. His success story was often seen as a dream come true. A man who had turned his childhood passion into a career and achieved incredible success doing what he loved. But despite all the fame and fortune, there were always whispers behind the scenes. For years, Mike had worked hard to build his empire, but like many people in the spotlight, there were always challenges that came with it. The pressure to maintain success was immense, and the balance between business and personal life was difficult. Behind the cameras, Mike had to face the realities of running a successful business. There were complicated deals, disagreements with partners, and the constant stress of staying relevant in an industry that was always changing. But no one knew what was happening behind closed doors. Fans saw Mike's life as perfect. He was living the American dream, and for the most part it seemed that way. However, not everything was as it seemed. One day something changed. The whispers that had been circulating for years finally started to catch the attention of the public. Mike's personal and professional life seemed to be unraveling. Rumors about legal battles, internal conflicts within his team, and even financial issues began to surface. These were not the kind of headlines fans expected to see about their favorite TV personality. Instead of seeing Mike as the charming, antique-loving star of American Pickers, people were starting to wonder if there was something darker lurking beneath the surface. Suddenly, the stories that had been kept behind closed doors started to spill out. And just when the pressure seemed to be at its highest, Mike found himself facing something that no one, not even his closest fans, had seen coming. The once unstoppable force that was Mike Wolfe seemed to be in trouble. The road that had once been paved with success now seemed uncertain. Fans were left with more questions than answers. What was really going on in Mike Wolfe's life? Was the dream he had worked so hard for starting to collapse? In the midst of this growing storm, Mike's name was becoming associated with legal troubles and court cases. The rumors were no longer just whispers, they were becoming headlines. The situation was becoming so serious that it was impossible to ignore. Fans began to ask themselves, how could this happen to someone like Mike Wolfe? The man who had built an empire on his passion for antiques was now facing a very different kind of battle. People were shocked and the questions kept coming. What exactly was happening? What were the consequences of all these legal battles? As the story unfolded, it became clear that Mike was no longer just the charming antique collector we all knew from TV. He was now facing something much more complicated. The pressures of fame, the legal challenges, and the weight of everything he had built over the years were taking their toll. But there was one thing that no one could have predicted: how Mike would react when he found out the full extent of what was coming next. For years, Mike Wolfe had been the face of American Pickers, known for his eye for hidden treasures and his passion for antiques. People trusted him, admired him, and believed in his story. He was seen as someone who turned his passion into a business that anyone could dream of. However, behind the camera, things were not as perfect as they appeared. There were always stories about the pressures of running a business, and while most fans focused on the excitement of the show, Mike had to deal with a whole different set of challenges that weren't shown on TV. The first signs that something was off came when whispers about legal issues started to surface. At first they were just rumors, small comments on social media or mentions in gossip columns. But as time passed, these whispers became louder. People started to wonder if Mike Wolfe's perfect world was starting to fall apart. The questions began to grow. What was happening behind the scenes? Was Mike in trouble, and what could have led to a situation where he was facing legal trouble? It wasn't long before the rumors turned into reality. Legal battles that had been quietly brewing for months were now making their way into the public eye. Mike Wolfe, the star of American Pickers, was now facing lawsuits, accusations and investigations. The same man who had made a career out of finding hidden treasures now found himself dealing with legal challenges that no one had ever expected. The first major issue that came to light was a lawsuit involving one of Mike's business partners. The details were unclear at first, but it became clear that there were disagreements over money, contracts, and the direction the business was going. It wasn't just a small dispute, this was serious. It involved millions of dollars and the stakes were high. The case quickly attracted attention, with people wondering how someone as successful as Mike could end up in such a mess. How could the man who seemed to have it all suddenly find himself in a legal battle over something so fundamental as money? But the problems didn't stop there. As more information came out, it became clear that the legal troubles were far more complicated than anyone had initially thought. It wasn't just one lawsuit, it was a whole string of them. Different parties started coming forward with accusations, some of them about things that went back years. Legal experts were saying that Mike's business was facing serious risks. The pressure started to mount, and it was obvious that Mike was struggling to keep things under control. Despite his best efforts, it seemed like things were only getting worse. Legal experts said that the more lawsuits Mike faced, the harder it would be for him to bounce back. His name, once synonymous with success, was now being linked with legal trouble. Fans who had supported him for years were starting to wonder what was going on behind closed doors. How could a man who had achieved so much suddenly be facing so much adversity? The public began to turn their attention to the details of the lawsuits. They wanted to know what had gone wrong. Why were these legal battles happening, and what did it mean for Mike's future? There were questions about contracts that hadn't been followed, partnerships that had soured, and accusations of mismanagement. Mike had always been known for his charm and easygoing nature, but now people were starting to wonder if he had been too trusting or too busy to notice the problems in his own business. As the legal storm intensified, it wasn't just Mike's business that was under threat. His reputation was on the line too. Mike had spent years building his name, not just as a TV star, but as an expert in the world of antiques. People trusted him to know what was valuable, what was worth saving, and what was just junk. But now, with all these legal battles unfolding, people began to question everything about Mike. Was he the same man who had built an empire on his passion, or was he someone who had gotten too big for his own good and let things spiral out of control? The media, of course, was quick to jump on the story. News outlets picked up the lawsuit reports, and before long, Mike's legal troubles were front and center. Fans were left stunned. How could a man who had achieved so much suddenly find himself in such a difficult situation? People who had watched Mike on TV, cheering him on as he found rare treasures, were now left with the uncomfortable thought that maybe they had been wrong about him. Were the rumors true? Was Mike's business really falling apart? Despite the negative press, Mike continued to push forward. He worked with his lawyers to try and resolve the issues, but the damage was already done. Public perception had shifted, and it seemed like no matter how hard Mike tried to explain or defend himself, the legal battles were overshadowing everything else. The trust that he had spent years building with his fans was now in question. Fans who had once admired Mike for his honesty and integrity were now wondering if he had been hiding something all along. As the lawsuits piled up and the media frenzy continued, one thing became clear: Mike was in deep. His personal and professional life were now in a state of chaos. For someone who had always been in control, this was a situation he had never faced before. The road to recovery, if there was one, seemed uncertain. Fans, critics, and the public were all waiting to see how Mike would handle this new chapter of his life. Would he be able to fix what had been broken, or was this the beginning of the end for the once celebrated star? The legal storm wasn't just a setback for Mike, it was a turning point in his life. The man who had once been the face of success was now facing his greatest challenge yet. And no one knew what would happen next. What would the future hold for Mike Wolfe? Would he rise above the storm, or would it consume him? The day Mike Wolfe walked into the courtroom, it was clear that everything had changed. No longer the charming star of American Pickers, he was now a man facing a battle that could determine the future of his career, his reputation, and his entire life. People who had once cheered for him were now wondering what had gone so wrong. How did things escalate to this point? The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Every eye was on Mike, waiting to see how he would react to what was about to unfold. His entire life had led to this moment, and no one knew what the outcome would be. Mike had been through many challenges in his life, but nothing like this. The legal battles he had faced earlier were just the beginning. Now he was facing something far more serious. The courtroom, a place where the fate of many is decided, was about to decide his future. The judge, the jury, and the public all had a front row seat to the drama that was about to unfold. The stakes were high, and Mike knew it. His face showed signs of wear, the weight of the situation clearly taking its toll on him. As Mike entered the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Everyone knew this was a crucial moment, not just for Mike, but for the world of American Pickers. His fans were watching, his business partners were waiting, and the media was ready to cover every word spoken in the room. Mike had always been in control when it came to his work and his public image, but now he was vulnerable, facing a legal storm that he could not control. How would he handle this pressure? Would the man who had once been so confident now crumble under the weight of everything he was facing? The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the proceedings began. Mike sat quietly at the table, his eyes fixed on the judge. He had been through many stressful situations in his life, but this was different. This was not just a disagreement with a business partner or a minor legal issue. This was about his freedom, his career, and his future. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The time for waiting was over. It was time for the truth to be revealed. The tension in the room grew as the judge began to speak. Every word was carefully considered, every decision was important. The judge wasn't just addressing Mike, he was addressing the public, the media, and the millions of fans who had been following Mike's journey. The judge's words would decide whether Mike would walk away from this unscathed, or whether his life would change forever. Mike sat still, but his mind was racing. He had been preparing for this moment for months, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the weight of what was happening. Every eye was on him, every camera was focused on his every move. And yet there was no turning back now. The judge spoke in a calm, steady voice, but the words that came next were far from calm. The decision was made. The sentence was delivered, and it was nothing like anyone had expected. The room fell into a stunned silence. Mike's heart raced as the full impact of the decision hit him. This was it. The moment he had been dreading for so long had finally arrived. He had worked his whole life to build a career based on honesty, hard work, and passion, but now, in the blink of an eye, it seemed like everything was slipping away. His face drained of color as he processed the words that had just been spoken. The consequences of the ruling were clear, and they were serious. The room remained silent, each person waiting to see how Mike would react. Mike had always been known for his calm demeanor, his ability to handle difficult situations with grace. But now it seemed like even his strength had been tested to the limit. As the weight of the judge's words sank in, Mike's face showed a mix of shock, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion. He had faced many challenges in his life, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. This was more than just a legal case, it was a turning point in his life. In the moments that followed, Mike's emotions began to show. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to process the reality of what had just happened. He was no longer the confident, collected figure who had once been seen as the face of American Pickers. Now he was a man who had been broken by a system he thought he could navigate. The emotional weight of the situation was too much to bear. The room was filled with a mixture of emotions. Some people felt sympathy for Mike, others felt angry at the system, and still, others felt that justice had been served. But one thing was certain, the outcome of this case was going to leave a lasting impact. No matter how Mike responded, his life would never be the same. For the fans who had followed him for years, this moment was a wake-up call. The man they had admired was no longer the same person they had seen on their screens. The perfect world they had imagined was suddenly shattered. For many, it was hard to reconcile the Mike Wolfe they had come to know with the man sitting in the courtroom, struggling to hold it all together. What had happened to the man who had built an empire on his love of antiques? How had things gone so wrong? But amidst the chaos, one thing was clear: Mike's life was about to change forever. The court case was far from over, and the consequences of the decision were far-reaching. As the session ended and the courtroom began to empty, one question lingered in the air: would Mike Wolfe be able to recover from this moment? Could he rebuild his reputation, or had the damage been done? The tension didn't dissipate when the court session ended. It hung in the air, leaving everyone wondering what would come next. The road ahead for Mike was uncertain, and no one could predict how things would unfold. But one thing was certain: this was the beginning of a new chapter in Mike Wolfe's life, and no one knew where it would lead. The courtroom was silent, and Mike Wolfe could feel the weight of every second. After the emotional roller coaster of the trial, the final moment had arrived. The judge's eyes were fixed on Mike, and the room held its breath, waiting for the decision that would change everything. For weeks, Mike had tried to prepare himself for the worst. He knew that his life, his career, and everything he had built could be on the line. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. Mike had faced challenges before, but this was different. The tension in the room was so thick that you could almost feel it in the air. His mind raced, trying to predict what was coming, but no matter how much he tried to prepare, the reality of the situation was far more intense than anything he had imagined. His heart pounded in his chest as the judge began to speak, each word making the tension grow heavier. For a brief moment, the judge paused, and Mike could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. It wasn't just a moment of silence, it was a moment of uncertainty. Everyone in the room was waiting for that final decision. What would it be? The room was filled with so many questions, but there was no answer yet. Mike's future hung in the balance. Then, with a steady voice, the judge finally spoke. The words that came next hit Mike like a ton of bricks. The sentence was far worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist or a small fine, it was a serious ruling that would have a lasting impact on his life. For a moment, Mike couldn't believe what he was hearing. His heart seemed to stop as the weight of the decision began to sink in. The man who had built a career around antiques, treasure hunting, and TV fame was now facing consequences that were unimaginable. The room was filled with a shocked silence. No one had expected this. Fans, reporters, and even the people who had once worked with Mike were left in disbelief. The sentence was not just a legal decision, it was a public statement. It was clear that Mike's actions had consequences, and those consequences were far-reaching. But why had it come to this? How had things gotten so bad? Mike's face drained of color as the full reality of the situation began to hit him. He had spent years building a career that many people admired, but now it seemed like all of it was unraveling in an instant. The pressure had been building for months, and now in this moment it was all coming to a head. What would happen next? How would Mike recover from this shocking sentence? The people in the courtroom had their own reactions. Some were stunned into silence, others whispered to one another, and some even showed signs of sympathy for Mike. But despite the varying reactions, there was one thing that everyone could agree on: Mike's life was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. The sentence had been delivered, and there was no going back. Mike sat in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. He had always been known for his calm and collected nature, but in this moment he couldn't hide the shock and disbelief that was clearly written on his face. The sentence had completely shattered the world he had built. All those years of hard work, dedication, and success seemed to have been wiped away in an instant. The man who had once been an inspiration to so many was now facing a future that was uncertain at best. As the judge finished speaking, the room began to settle. But for Mike, everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. His mind was racing, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. The sentence was not just a legal issue, it was a personal blow. Mike had always prided himself on his integrity and his love for what he did, but now, that was being called into question. How could this happen to him? How had things gone so wrong? The courtroom emptied slowly, but Mike remained seated. His eyes were fixed on the ground, trying to make sense of everything. The weight of the decision was too much to bear. How could he face the world now? His name had been everything to him, and now it felt like it was crumbling before his eyes. The consequences of the sentence were clear. Mike's life as he knew it was never going to be the same again. But even in this moment of devastation, there was a lingering question: could Mike Wolfe recover from this? Was there any way to rebuild his life after such a shocking ruling? For some, the answer seemed clear: Mike's career was over, and the public's perception of him would never be the same. But for others, the question remained: could Mike find a way to bounce back? Could he rebuild his reputation and reclaim his place in the spotlight? As Mike left the courtroom, the weight of the sentence continued to follow him. The world was watching, and everyone was waiting to see how he would respond. Would he fight back? Would he try to explain himself? Or would he accept the consequences and fade into the background? The public was waiting for answers, and Mike knew that the next chapter of his life would be defined by how he handled this moment. In the days that followed, the media frenzy continued. The headlines were filled with news of Mike's shocking sentence, and the public was divided. Some felt sympathy for him. Others felt anger, and still, others were just curious about what would come next. Mike's life had taken an unexpected turn, and no one knew what would happen next. But one thing was certain: Mike Wolfe's story was far from over. The sentence may have been shocking, but it was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life. How he responded to this moment would determine whether he could rebuild his life, or whether his fall from grace would be permanent. The world was watching, and Mike's next move was the most important one of his life. The moment Mike Wolfe's sentence was revealed to the world, everything changed. The life he had built for so many years was now under intense scrutiny. It wasn't just his legal troubles that were in the spotlight. His entire career, his reputation, and his personal life were now at risk. People who had admired him, watched his show, and looked up to him for years were now questioning everything. How had a man who seemed so trustworthy, so hardworking, ended up in such a mess? Was there something they didn't know about him? Was the man they thought they knew someone entirely different? Mike had spent years building a fan base, creating an image of a simple man with a love for history and antiques. He had become a household name, the star of American Pickers, someone whose knowledge and passion made him beloved by millions. But now all of that seemed to be unraveling in front of everyone. The media picked up on every detail of his legal troubles, and the public watched closely to see how he would handle the situation. The pressure was enormous. No matter how hard Mike tried to stay calm, it was clear that the world had begun to turn against him. It didn't take long for the rumors to start swirling. Social media platforms, where people once celebrated Mike's finds and adventures, were now filled with mixed opinions. Some people defended him, saying that everyone makes mistakes and that he didn't deserve such harsh treatment. Others, however, couldn't stop questioning his character. The legal battle, the sentences, and the accusations had planted seeds of doubt in many minds. Was Mike Wolfe really the man people thought he was, or had he been hiding something all along? Fans began to share their thoughts publicly. The once supportive messages now seemed to carry a tone of uncertainty. Some fans felt betrayed, their admiration for Mike replaced with a sense of betrayal. The trust they had in him was now in question. They felt as though they had been misled by the image of Mike that had been carefully constructed for the cameras. And then there were those who outright turned on him. The disappointment was clear. They felt like they had invested so much of their time following his story, only to be let down when the truth came out. For Mike, the public fallout was unlike anything he had ever faced. He was used to having fans support him, used to people admiring his work and his passion. But now he was facing a world that seemed divided over him. Some people stood by him, hoping that the situation was just a misunderstanding or a mistake, but many others couldn't forgive him, and those voices grew louder with each passing day. The weight of their judgment was hard to ignore. The media didn't help either. Every time Mike's name appeared in the news, it was tied to scandal, legal trouble, and questions about his character. The man who had once been seen as a symbol of success was now a symbol of disappointment for many. For weeks, Mike tried to stay quiet, focusing on his legal battles and trying to figure out what his next steps would be. But the more he stayed silent, the more the media continued to dig. The questions about his life, his business, and his choices became louder. What had gone wrong? Why had he let things spiral out of control? People wanted answers, and Mike knew that silence would no longer protect him. The public wanted to hear from him, but could he explain himself in a way that would win back their trust? It was clear that Mike was struggling with the fallout. He had spent so many years building an image of someone who could be trusted, but now everything was under a microscope. Every decision he made, every word he said, was analyzed and criticized. The people who had once seen him as a role model were now questioning whether they had made a mistake. How could Mike fix this? Was it even possible for him to regain the respect he had lost? For Mike, it wasn't just about fixing his public image, it was about trying to rebuild his life. The legal battles were far from over, but the emotional toll of the public fallout was taking its toll. Every day he faced the harsh reality that the world was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. He had always been in control of his career and his public image, but now he was struggling to keep his head above water. How would he recover from this? And the worst part was, no one knew what the next move would be. Would Mike step forward and admit his mistakes, trying to rebuild his reputation piece by piece, or would he continue to stay silent, hoping that time would heal the wounds? Each option came with its own risks. If Mike tried to explain himself, there was a chance that it might not be enough. The damage to his reputation had been done, and no amount of words could take away the hurt some people felt. But if he remained silent, the public would continue to judge him without any answers. It was a catch-22, and Mike had no clear way out. Behind closed doors, Mike had to face his own demons. The public reaction was only one part of the fallout. The real pain was in facing the reality of what had happened. Mike had worked so hard to get to where he was, but now he had to reckon with the fact that everything might come crashing down. The guilt, the shame, and the disappointment were things he would have to live with. And no matter how hard he tried to focus on the future, the weight of the past kept dragging him back. But there was still hope. The question was, what would Mike do with it? He had the opportunity to make a comeback, to rebuild his life and his career, but it wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was uncertain, and the public's opinion of him would take time to change. Some people would never forgive him, but others might be willing to give him another chance. The key was whether Mike could face the challenge head-on, take responsibility for his actions, and prove to the world that he was more than just a man caught in a scandal. The fallout from Mike's legal troubles wasn't just about what happened in the courtroom, it was about how the world viewed him now. His life, his career, and his legacy were all at risk, but even in the midst of this chaos, there was still a chance for Mike to rebuild. He had to decide how he would face this new chapter of his life, and whether he would have the strength to rise from the ashes of his public downfall. After everything that had happened, Mike Wolfe found himself at a crossroads. His career, his reputation, and even his personal life were all in pieces. The public had turned on him, his fans were questioning his every move, and his future was uncertain. It was easy for many to assume that Mike's story was over, that the damage was too great and he wouldn't be able to bounce back. But Mike wasn't ready to give up. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that redemption was possible. It would take time, hard work, and the willingness to face the consequences of his actions, but it wasn't impossible. Mike had always been someone who faced challenges head-on. Whether it was hunting for antiques or dealing with the ups and downs of his career, he had learned to persevere. But this was different. This wasn't just about finding the next rare item or negotiating a good deal. It was about reclaiming his life and rebuilding trust. Mike had a choice to make. He could either fade into the background and let the public continue to judge him, or he could fight to rebuild his reputation, piece by piece. But the question was, where would he begin? The first step in his road to redemption was acknowledging the mistakes he had made. Mike could no longer hide from the truth. He couldn't pretend that nothing had happened or that everything was fine. People expected answers, and Mike knew he had to be honest about what had happened. But being honest wasn't easy. It meant admitting to things that he had never wanted to face, and owning up to the consequences of his actions. It meant letting go of his pride, and accepting that things had gone wrong, despite his best efforts to prevent it. But even as Mike began to face the reality of the situation, there were still so many questions that remained. Could he truly redeem himself after everything that had happened? Would people be willing to give him a second chance, or had they already made up their minds about him? The weight of these questions hung over Mike as he navigated the next steps in his journey. It was easy to feel lost in the midst of all the criticism and uncertainty, but Mike knew that the road to redemption would require patience and perseverance. One of the biggest challenges Mike faced was regaining the trust of his fans. Trust is something that is built over time, and once it is broken, it can be incredibly difficult to rebuild. Mike had always been seen as a trustworthy figure, someone who was genuine and hard-working. But now, people were questioning whether that image had been an illusion. The fans who had once looked up to him were now divided. Some still believed in him, but others had turned their backs. Mike couldn't change the past, but he could work to rebuild his relationship with his fans moving forward. Mike knew that actions spoke louder than words. He couldn't simply apologize and expect everything to be okay. He had to show people that he was committed to making things right. That meant taking responsibility for his mistakes and showing that he had learned from them. It wasn't going to be an overnight process, and there would be setbacks along the way, but Mike was determined to prove that he was capable of change. The media, which had once been his ally, was now part of the challenge he faced. The negative press had hurt him deeply, but Mike realized that he couldn't control what others said about him. What he could control, however, was how he responded. He knew that the more he stayed quiet, the more the media would continue to speculate about him. The public wanted to know how he was handling everything, and if he stayed silent, they would only see him as someone who had given up. Mike began to speak out more, sharing his side of the story in interviews and public appearances. He acknowledged the mistakes he had made and explained how he was working to make things right. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't comfortable, but Mike knew that being open about his struggles was the only way to move forward. People didn't expect him to be perfect, they just wanted to see that he was genuinely trying to fix the damage that had been done. But as Mike worked to rebuild his reputation, he was faced with the reality that not everyone would forgive him. Some people would never change their opinion of him, no matter what he did, and that was something Mike had to accept. The road to redemption wasn't about pleasing everyone, it was about finding peace within himself and doing the right thing, even if others didn't recognize or appreciate it. In the process of rebuilding his life, Mike also had to focus on his personal growth. The public fallout had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself, and it became clear that he had a lot of work to do. Redemption wasn't just about fixing his image, it was about becoming a better person. Mike had always prided himself on being genuine, but the challenges he faced had forced him to dig deeper and look at the parts of himself that he had been avoiding. He began to take more time for self-reflection, learning from his mistakes, and working on becoming someone who could face his challenges with more maturity and strength. As time passed, Mike slowly started to regain some of his former supporters. His fans, who had been skeptical at first, began to see the changes he was making, and they started to believe that he was truly trying to make things right. It wasn't a quick fix, but Mike's determination and willingness to learn from his past mistakes helped him rebuild some of the trust he had lost. The road was still long, and there were many obstacles ahead, but Mike was no longer the same person he had been before the scandal. The media, too, began to shift its focus. While some outlets continued to report negatively about him, others began to recognize his efforts to change. Slowly, Mike started to gain back some of the positive attention that had once defined his career. But he knew that the road ahead was still full of challenges. Redemption wasn't something that could be achieved with a few good deeds, it was something that would take years of hard work and persistence. Mike wasn't looking for a quick fix or instant forgiveness. He knew that redemption was a journey, not a destination. For Mike, the road to redemption was about more than just repairing his public image. It was about becoming a better person, facing his past, and proving that he could grow from his mistakes. It was about showing the world that even when everything seemed lost, it was still possible to rise again.